Picture this. The sun is a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the frontier. You are standing on the porch of a small, isolated cabin, a place that has become more tomb than home. The dust, stirred by a hot, indifferent wind, chokes you. It coats your tongue, grits in your eyes, and settles like a shroud over the silent monuments of your grief. And there, against the split-rail fence that marks the edge of your property, the edge of your world, are four small figures. Not playing, not resting. They are tied to the fence posts with coarse rope, their heads bowed like wilted flowers. They are children, four of them, left like unwanted livestock, abandoned to the heat and the silence and the circling buzzards that are already beginning to draw lazy circles in the sky. Your heart, a stone you thought could never feel anything again, cracks. A terrible, agonizing fissure runs through the frozen landscape of your sorrow. What do? Do you turn away, bolting the door against a world that has already taken everything from you? Or do you walk toward them, into the blinding sun, and invite a new and terrifying storm into the wreckage of your life? Alara didn't have to imagine it. She lived it. The cabin was her sanctuary and her prison. Built with the hands of a husband the fever had stolen. Meant to echo with the laughter of a daughter the same fever had silenced. Now only the wind spoke in the empty rooms. Every morning, she rose and faced the vast, empty horizon. Her soul as barren as the land around her. Grief was a physical weight, a cloak she could not shrug off. It had hollowed out her eyes, silvered the hair at her temples, and carved lines of permanent sorrow around a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. She existed. She did not live. Until this moment. The sight of the children was a cruel mirage at first, a trick of the heat haze. But the mirage didn't fade. It solidified into a nightmare of limp limbs and sunburnt necks. A cold fury, an emotion she hadn't felt in years, cut through the fog of her apathy. It was a single, sharp command from a part of her she thought had died. Move. Her boots crunched on the parched ground as she crossed the yard, each step a reluctant beat of a reawakening heart. The closer she got, the more brutal the details became. The oldest, a boy of no more than 10, had positioned himself to try and shield the others, his face a defiant mask of grime and premature responsibility. Next to him, a girl slightly younger, with hair the color of dried straw, stared at her own dusty boots, trembling. A second boy, smaller still, had tears tracking clean paths through the dirt on his cheeks. And the last one, the smallest, a little girl with tangled black curls, was so still Alara feared the worst. She knelt, her fingers fumbling with the rough knots on the little girl's wrists. The rope was tight, chafing the delicate skin raw. The child didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. She was limp, her breathing shallow. One by one, Alara's knife, the one she used for gardening and whittling away the lonely hours, severed the ropes. The children didn't run. They slumped against the fence, too exhausted or too terrified to move. She offered them water from her canteen, a gesture that felt foreign, clumsy. The oldest boy watched her. His eyes narrowed with the suspicion of a cornered animal. He took the canteen only after she'd held it to the lips of the others. He drank last, his gaze never leaving her face. Who did this? Alara's voice was a rusty hinge, unused and harsh. The boy shook his head, his jaw set. He would not speak. He would not betray whatever desperate pact of silence he had made with his siblings. They were a unit, a tiny, fractured fortress against the world. Alara knew she couldn't leave them here, but the thought of bringing them into that silent cabin, into the spaces still haunted by the ghosts of her own family, was a physical pain. Felt like a betrayal. Yet, to leave them was a sin her soul could not bear. She stood, her own body aching with indecision. She was a widow, a ghost herself. What could she offer them but the shadow of her own sorrow? As she hesitated, lost in the desert of her own heart, the smallest girl, who had been leaning against her leg for support, stirred. She looked up, her eyes a startling, clear blue in her dirt-smeared face. Her lips parted, and a sound, barely a breath, escaped. It was a single word, a whisper that the wind almost stole away. Alara! The world stopped. The hammering sun, the buzzing flies, the screaming silence in her own head. It all vanished. How could this child, a stranger left to die at her fence, know her name? The sound of it, spoken in that tiny, fragile voice, was not an accusation or a plea. It was a key turning a lock deep inside her that had been rusted shut with grief. It was the name her husband used to whisper in the dark. The name her daughter had just been learning to form on her lips. It shattered her paralysis. The question of why no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the 4 pairs of eyes staring up at her, reflecting a loneliness that was a perfect mirror of her own. She scooped the smallest girl into her arms, her body surprisingly light, and met the fierce gaze of the oldest boy. "Come on," she said, her voice softer now, steadier. "Let's go home." He hesitated for only a second longer, then gathered his other 2 siblings, and together, the 5 of them walked away from the fence, a broken, hopeful procession moving toward the shelter of the silent cabin. The ghosts within would have to make room. The first few days were a tense and silent ballet of survival. Alara moved through the motions of care with a mechanical precision, her actions detached from her emotions. She cleaned them, fed them the last of her stew, and laid them to sleep on blankets before the cold hearth. They were Jacob, Martha, Samuel, and the little one, Lily. Jacob, the eldest, remained her shadow, his eyes watching every move she made, his posture a constant, protective shield around the others. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and sharp, a boy forced to become a man too soon. Martha was the quiet observer, her gaze holding a deep, ancient sadness. Samuel was the first to cry, a storm of pent-up fear and exhaustion that broke one night, his sobs filling the cabin's oppressive silence. Alara held him, awkwardly at first, then with a fierce, protective instinct that surprised her. But it was Lily who slowly, unknowingly, began to mend the broken pieces of Alara's heart. The child who had whispered her name seemed to possess an intuition far beyond her years. She would simply appear at Alara's side, placing a smooth river stone in her hand or leaning her small head against Alara's knee as she sat staring into the fire. These small, silent gestures were anchors, pulling Alara back from the endless ocean of her grief. A week after their arrival, a figure appeared on the horizon. A man on a horse, moving with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke of familiarity with the land. Alara's hand instinctively went to the shotgun propped against the doorframe, a relic of her husband she hadn't touched in years. The children scurried behind her, Jacob placing himself in front of the others like a small, defiant general. The man stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin and dismounted. He was tall and broad, with a face weathered by the sun and a life of hardship. A long, thin scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, giving his expression a permanent severity. This was Silas, her nearest neighbor, though near was a relative term in this vast emptiness. He lived 5 miles to the east, a solitary man who kept to himself, a man rumored to have a past he'd ridden a long way to escape. They had exchanged little more than curt nods on her rare trips to the town of Redemption for supplies. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. His eyes, a cool, steady gray, flickered from her face to the small heads peeking out from behind her skirts. He didn't ask the question that was surely on his mind. Instead, he gestured with his head toward a small cart he was pulling. "Saw you didn't make it to town for supplies. Figured you might be running low." In the cart were sacks of flour, beans, and a small barrel of salted pork. It was a fortune. It was a lifeline. Alara's pride warred with her desperation. The children's hungry faces decided the battle. I can't pay you for this," she managed to say, her voice tight. Silas simply shrugged, his gaze fixed on the broken section of her fence where the children had been tied. "It's not a loan," he said. "It's a neighbor's duty." He didn't pry. He didn't ask where the children came from. He simply unloaded the supplies onto her porch, gave a curt nod, and turned to leave. As he mounted his horse, Jacob stepped out from behind Alara. "The fence post is cracked," the boy said, his small voice clear and surprisingly firm. "The one they tied me to." Silas looked down at the boy, a flicker of something unreadable in his gray eyes. It might have been respect. "I'll be back tomorrow to fix it," he said, and he was. Silas became a quiet, steady presence. He never entered the house unless invited, which he never was. He simply appeared, did what needed doing, and left. He mended the fence, repaired the leaky roof of the barn, and helped Alara dig a new well when the old one ran dry. He worked with a silent efficiency, his powerful hands gentle and precise. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were spare and meaningful. He taught Jacob how to set a rabbit snare and how to tell which way the wind was blowing by the slant of the grass. He showed Martha how to find the sweet, edible roots that grew by the dry creek bed. He even carved a small, perfect wooden bird for Lily, who carried it with her everywhere. Alara watched him, her initial suspicions slowly melting into a cautious gratitude. She saw in his solitude a reflection of her own. He too was haunted. She could see it in the way he stared at the horizon, in the way his hand sometimes drifted to the hilt of the knife on his belt, a gesture born of old violent habits. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, she found the courage to ask, "Who are you running from, Silas?" He was leaning against the newly mended fence, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. He didn't look at her, but the muscles in his jaw tightened. "Not who," he said, his voice rough. "What? I'm running from the man I used to be." He said no more, and she didn't press. She understood. They were two ghosts, tending a garden of small, resurrected lives. Slowly, miraculously, the cabin began to fill with sound again. It was the sound of Samuel's laughter as Silas swung him in the air, the sound of Martha humming a tune as she helped Alara bake bread, the sound of Jacob proudly explaining his new snare traps. It was the sound of a family being forged not from blood, but from shared silence, shared hardship, and the shared, unspoken promise to protect one another. Alara found herself smiling, a strange and wonderful sensation, like feeling the sun on her face after a long winter. The ache of her past was still there, a dull throb beneath the surface, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was a scar, not a wound. She was beginning to live again, but the fragile piece of their new world was built on borrowed time, and the past has a way of coming to collect its debts. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon first, a smudge of angry brown against the placid blue sky. It resolved itself into a buggy, a fine one, pulled by two matching black horses that moved with an arrogant clip-clop. A sense of dread, cold and familiar, settled over Alara. She sent the children inside, her voice sharp with an urgency that made Jacob's hand fly to the small knife Silas had given him. Silas, who had been reinforcing the corral, straightened up, his body going still and watchful, like a wolf scenting danger on the wind. The buggy pulled up before the cabin, and a man stepped down. He was dressed in a fine black suit, incongruous and predatory in the rustic setting. His face was fleshy and pale, his smile a thin, bloodless slash. Alara recognized him instantly. Mayor Thornton, the man who ran the town of Redemption with a velvet glove that hid an iron fist. He was a man who collected power and people, a man whose benevolence always came with a price. "Mrs. Davies," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He removed his hat, but the gesture was one of possession, not respect. His eyes scanned the small homestead, lingering on the repaired fence, the tended garden, the signs of life that had returned to this desolate place. "I must say you've made quite the recovery. The town has worried for you in your seclusion." His gaze flickered past her, toward the cabin door where four small faces were pressed against the window pane. His smile widened. "It seems my property has found its way to you. I've come to collect it." Alara's blood ran cold. "Property?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "They are children." Thornton chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "They are wards of the town, my dear lady. Indentured to me, legally and formally, to pay off their deceased father's debts. A drunk and a cheat, I'm afraid. They are fortunate I was willing to take them on. They ran away from my care, the ungrateful little things. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket, waving them like a fan. It is all here, signed, sealed. The law is on my side. The world tilted. The 4 children were not orphans in the way she had imagined. They were fugitives. They had been running from this man. She looked back at the window, at Jacob's fierce glare, at Martha's terrified eyes, and she understood the silence, the fear. Silas moved to stand beside her, a silent, solid wall of intimidation. His hand rested near his hip. He didn't speak, but his presence was a clear challenge. Thornton's eyes narrowed, taking in Silas's scarred face and powerful build. "Stay out of this, drifter," he snapped. "This is a matter of town law. This is a matter of decency." Silas rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "And you're standing on private land." For a moment, tension crackled between the 2 men, a promise of violence shimmering in the hot air. But Thornton was a creature of calculated power, not reckless brawling. He preferred the clean, inescapable weapon of the law. "I see you've found yourself a protector," he sneered at Alara. "It won't matter. I will be back, Mrs. Davies. With the sheriff. You are harboring stolen property. Think carefully about the consequences." He climbed back into his buggy, his movements precise and unhurried. As the buggy turned, he called back, "They belong to me, and I always get back what is mine." The dust settled, leaving behind a silence more profound and terrifying than any that had come before. The fragile peace was shattered. Alara pulled the children into her arms, her body a shield against the fear that now permeated the air. Jacob looked up at her, his young face old with worry. "We can't go back with him," he whispered. He's a bad man." Alara held him tighter. "You won't," she vowed, the words a prayer and a declaration of war. That night, the storm that had been threatening on the edges of their lives finally broke. The wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the windows like an angry spirit. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets. Inside, the 6 of them huddled around the fire, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The storm outside was a mirror of the turmoil within. For the first time, Alara and Silas truly spoke. He told her of his past, of a time when he wore a badge and tried to uphold a law that was too often bent to the will of powerful men. He spoke of a family he had failed to protect, a mistake that had cost him everything and sent him into self-imposed exile. "I ran," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing, his eyes fixed on the flames. "I ran when I should have stood and fought. I won't make that mistake again." Alara, in turn, spoke of her husband and daughter, not with the hollow ache of grief, but with the warmth of memory. She told the children stories of them, giving them shape and life, sharing her ghosts so they would no longer have the power to haunt her alone. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by the family she had found and the man who had chosen to stand with them, Alara felt a new kind of strength solidify within her. It was not the brittle strength of survival, but the resilient, unyielding power of love. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. She had something to fight for again. As the storm raged, they made a plan. They would not run. This small patch of land, this humble cabin, was their home. They would make their stand here. They would face the law with the truth, and if that failed, they would face it with whatever strength they had left. The storm passed with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. They knew Thornton would be back. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, 3 riders appeared, silhouetted against the morning sun. Thornton was in the lead, but this time he was flanked by 2 hired men, rough-looking brutes with guns strapped to their hips. The sheriff was not with them. This was not a matter of law anymore. It was a matter of force. Silas met them in the yard, his shotgun held loosely, casually in his hands. Alara stood on the porch, her own husband's rifle gripped tight, its wooden stock smooth and familiar against her cheek. The children were inside, barricaded in the small root cellar, under Jacob's watchful eye. "This is your last chance, Davies," Thornton spat, his face contorted with rage. "Give me the children, and I'll forget this foolishness. Defy me, and this man will die, and I will burn this shack to the ground with you in it. They're not yours to take." Alara's voice rang out, clear and steady, with none of the tremor she'd felt before. "They are my family," Thornton laughed, a cruel barking sound. "Family? You are a broken woman hiding in a ruin. You have nothing." "She has me," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. He took a step forward. That was all it took. One of Thornton's men, eager and stupid, drew his pistol. It was a fatal mistake. Silas moved with a speed that was terrifying, a blur of motion from his past life. His shotgun roared, the sound echoing like a crack of doom across the plains. The hired man was thrown from his saddle. The second man, stunned, fumbled for his own weapon, but a shot from the porch kicked up the dirt at his horse's feet. He looked up to see the haunted widow, her eye sighted down the barrel of a rifle, her expression one of absolute resolve. He dropped his gun, hands raised high. Thornton sat frozen on his horse, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His power, built on fear and intimidation, had crumbled against two people with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He stared at Alara, at the woman he had dismissed as a fragile recluse, and saw in her eyes a fire he could not extinguish. He saw the righteous fury of a mother protecting her young. He turned his horse and fled, a coward stripped of his authority, leaving his wounded man groaning in the dust. It was over. The immediate threat was gone. Silas tended to the wounded man while Alara let the children out of the cellar. They rushed to her, their arms wrapping around her legs, their faces buried in her skirt. She knelt and held them, all four of them, feeling the frantic, living beat of their hearts against her own. She looked over their heads at Silas, who was watching them, a small, weary smile touching the corner of his scarred mouth. In his eyes, she saw the ghost of the man he used to be finally, blessedly, laid to rest. The silence that fell was not empty. It was full of hope, full of relief, full of the unspoken promise of a future. So what truly makes a family? Is it a name written on a piece of paper, a legal document held by a man in a black suit? Or is it something forged in the fire, something built from the ashes of a broken past? Is it the courage to walk out into the blinding sun and cut the ropes that bind a stranger? Is it the quiet strength to stand your ground when the world comes to take away the only thing that matters? We all face fences in our lives. We all encounter those who are lost, abandoned, and tied down by circumstances they cannot control. The question is, what do we do? Do we turn away and lock our doors, or do we step forward with an open heart, ready to build a new home, a new life, a new family, right where we stand? If this story of courage and redemption touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. Every story of hope matters. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales that remind us of the strength we all hold within.